Okay, so welcome to ACCA Australia and New Zealand's APM technical webinar. My name is Sam Trarick and I'm the Education Engagement Manager for ACCA ANZ, and I'm so very glad that you've taken advantage of this great opportunity to learn from an expert tutor in the field and to be able to ask questions you may have. Your tutor for this webinar is Jeff Cordwell. Jeff is the performance management guru and an ex-UK examining body examiner. He has taught performance management subjects since its creation, and his students have enjoyed unprecedented pass rates. He is a published author of performance management articles and has marked thousands of scripts, and this allows him to understand students' issues. Over to you, Jeff, and enjoy, students.
Okay, thanks, Sam. Look, hi, everybody. Welcome. It's really quite exciting, isn't it? We're all in different time zones, I know. I'm up nice and early in the UK. The dog here with me is utterly horrified. What are we doing up at 6 a.m? It's now 8 just after here, and I think the intention was that we'd have about 2 hours. So and therefore in New Zealand that would make it 9 o'clock at night before we finish, if I've got the timing right there. What are we going to do? I mean, what did I set out to do? I've written some specific material, which I hope will give you a bit of a leg up, if you like, on your journey towards APM. I know that from what Sam has told me that most of you are studying this to June. Perhaps in the chat panel, you could just confirm that. Are you doing June? Or are you doing September? We think you're all doing June, which means, of course, this is quite appropriate, isn't it? Because the revision sort of session is close. If you've got a revision session set up, my revision session setting up to start on Monday, and maybe a week after there's a soft launch and a hard launch. There's an early start, effectively, and a normal start on the 2nd of May. So it looks like Alexia and Gul are doing this in June, and this is therefore extremely well timed, I suppose. So what we're going to do is have a look at what APM is about, not, if you like, in an intro sense, because obviously you're doing the exam in June, you're past that point a little bit, but in a little bit more detail, looking at 2 or 3 key areas. And in particular, what I thought I'd do is talk about what I think the examiner's up to here, because I'm pretty close to this examiner. I know this person. I was involved in the examining team years and years ago, as Sam has just mentioned. So I'm very much on the inside of this. I have no privy knowledge, by the way. I'm not implying that I do. But nonetheless, I think I understand APM and what the examiner's about and what he's up to in quite a lot of detail, really. So we're going to have a look, not so much in the detail of the syllabus, but, what the main thrusts of the syllabus are and what's the point of it all. And in particular, look at this, the mindset of the examining team. What are they trying to do here? What's going on behind this paper? In SBR, you might say what they're trying to do is get you to be able to produce accounts and financial statements in an appropriate fashion. Yeah, in tax, they want you to calculate the appropriate tax liability, presumably. Not that I'm close to any of these papers particularly. In SBL, they want you to be able to assess the strategy of a business and come up with a new one if necessary. So what is the APM about? What is exactly going on? Because in some ways, I think pinning down what APM is about is a little bit more difficult, I think, than perhaps other papers. Yeah. Then, okay, once we've established, if you like, those key examining principles, what they're trying to do, let's have a look at how this is tested. Because this exam isn't predictable in the traditional sense. I couldn't tell you what's going to come up in June. I mean, no, APM is incredibly unpredictable like that. But the main philosophies will be examined. That is for certain. And, how exactly is this tested is very common and very standard from one sitting to the next. Even though the individual subject matter might be slightly different, the overall thrust is always the same. What we're then going to do is apply that to key areas. I've picked out 3 things that always come up, but pretty commonly come up. One of them, for example, is key performance indicators. That will get examined. That will be 15% of your exam in June, almost certainly. Yeah, just bear with me a second. I'll just admit somebody. So we'll look at 3 particular examinable areas and try and, if you like, take this examining principle and apply it to those areas. We're then going to look at how to prepare. I have to say, when I first produced this material, I didn't know you were all doing it in June. It was advertised, wasn't it? So it could have been people to do it in September. So I might have to be a bit nimble and change a little bit what I was going to say, but I can do that. I'm aware that you're pretty good with test reach, because it's quite common for you guys to do the exam remotely, certainly in Australia, for example, Sam was telling me before we started. But I just wanted to mention the importance of practice on test reach. You may well already be fully familiar with that. Now I know a little bit more from my briefing a moment ago. Yeah, and then talk a little bit about marking feedback and how important that is in this particular paper. See, if you're doing a tax computation and you get a calculation wrong, you can look at the answer and know that you've done that, can't you? If you're doing a consolidated balance sheet and you make a mistake in the non-current assets, I've always called them fixed assets, I'm sorry, non-current, like say my name is not James, but anyway, non-current assets, and you've made a mistake, you'll be able to recognize that and see where you've gone wrong. Well, you can't do that in APM. APM, of all the papers, in my humble opinion, is the one paper where self-study and self-marking is inordinately difficult. And I'm really not just saying that. I mean, I'm a very sincere person. I'm from Oldham in North Manchester, and we always call a spade there. And so whenever I say something, I truly mean it. So let's have a think about if you like, the performance management syllabus. I've always been very interested, as Sam just mentioned, I was around in the early days of performance management. I wrote the old PM syllabus originally for the ACCA, in if you like, a concept called making more beans. I was always interested in management accounting as a concept and the usefulness of it to genuine business. Yeah, so I'm not interested in accounting for beans. I'm not interested in taxing the beans. Yeah, what I'm interested in is making more beans. And of course, performance management systems, if you like, attempt to do that. And and what is a performance management system? What are we talking about? Well, it's anything, if you like, that helps in the delivery of strategy. So the setting, if you like, of KPIs, the measurement of performance is obviously part of a performance management system. Targeting people so they know, if you like, broadly speaking, just roughly where you're aiming to be, is part of a performance management system. There's plenty of evidence to suggest that if people know what they're aiming at, they're much more likely to achieve that. Yeah, I've really let my personal fitness go a little bit lately. I don't know why. I can't seem to get going again. I am 62. I should perhaps forgive myself. But I know if I started to target myself to do 50, 60 press-ups a day and lift some weights every day and put it down on a sheet of paper, a spreadsheet or something, and record it, I'm much more likely to do that. Yeah. Equally, if I reward myself, I'm thinking today, it's a beautiful day outside. I've got up really early to do this. I'm going to reward myself later on. I'm going to go and play golf in the afternoon, I've decided. I've got another webinar tonight, but in between, I've got a bit of space and my next door neighbour's chomping at the bit. He mentioned it yesterday. Yeah, so rewards are a very good motivator, aren't they? And for business, that's also true. Yeah, so all these things on the screen are different performance management systems because they engender the idea that you're more productive and you produce more things. And that can get complicated if you could be, performance management systems focusing on a particular area, for example, like quality's on the screen. Oh, excuse me. Sorry, it's a new software, this. I've got to be super careful with it. So improving quality, TQM or Kaizen, for example, Kaizen can be cost control, of course, but Kaizen costing could also be something to do with quality. Is a performance management system in a specific area, or you could have a divisional situation. So the whole syllabus is all about trying to make sure that we can make more beans, perform better within our strategy. Yeah, there's also lots of performance management philosophy models that can be applied to improve a performance management system. This is where you get a little bit of confusion. These things here, PEST and BCG, actually are not performance management models. They're strategic models. And there's definitely a confusion that floats around, I think. The overlap, if you like, between strategy, Sbl, and APM. And I do want to deal with that. Make sure that you're clear on that before you start your revision, soon. Yeah. But then you've also got these models here, balanced scorecard, building block, and pyramid. I mean, these are specific performance management system models. They're all old. I mean, anyone like to guess when the balanced scorecard came along? In the chat panel. When do you think that was invented? I studied the balanced scorecard. That's how old that is. I was at university in 1977. And in 1981, 82, the balanced scorecard came along. So it's been around a long, long time, and it's still the daddy, effectively. It's still the most important methodology. But there's very little come out recently. It's very interesting, this. It's a very slow-moving world, is performance management. Now, this is what's important. Just bear with me a minute, because again, someone's arriving late. There we go. This is very important. Oh, someone else, hold on a moment. Just bear with me. I've got all sorts of people suddenly arriving. Hold on a moment. Sorry about this. Hi, welcome everybody. We started a few minutes ago. The examiner, I think, has a particular mindset, a particular way, of thinking about this particular paper. Yeah, and I happen to think he's probably right. I think he thinks that performance management systems lag behind the business and its environment. Yeah, so in other words, if you think about what's happened in the last 2 or 3 years with the COVID pandemic, pretty awful situation, and we're all quite jealous of the way Australia's handled this, by the way. We all think you've done great over there in this particular area. But there's change, isn't there? There's environmental shift, so for example, there's digitization around, isn't there? So therefore, in educational businesses like mine, for example, I operate completely digitally. I've got a digital product. I've not got a recording of live products shoved out and pretending it's digital. A 6.5-hour lecture recorded on a website is an awful product, in my opinion. I've got digital products, 1-hour modules, little tests, things that are a little bit more interactive. So there's environmental shift. Yeah, and for example, a lot of you are working from home, so there's environmental shift. But the question is, has the performance management system for the business that you work for also shifted? I mean, the environment changes all the time, doesn't it? And the strategy must change, otherwise the business will fail. I mean, those things are absolutely true. You have to reflect your environment in your strategy, and that, if you like, is what Sbl is about, isn't it? But the point is, because of the lack of regulation, because of a lack of insistence by government, the performance management system might not change. You might continue to report, exactly what you've always reported, month in, month out, without alteration. And ask yourself this question: is your month end this a mindless process of repetition, churning out pointless reports that perhaps most people don't read? Is that the situation? Now, that's what the examiner thinks, and he's pretty cross about it. In other words, the budgeting process or the rewards process or the targets process, the things I talked about before, even the quality processes aren't up to date. And I think he's right. I really think he's right. Performance management systems change, if you like, a little bit too slowly or a lot too slowly. If you're working from home, surely your day-to-day performance targets should also have shifted. And if you're in an organization that has shifted that, then that's absolutely fine. And it's that drives the entire exam. Just hold on a moment. I've more people arriving. Just hold on a second. Yeah, that drives the entire exam. So that's what the exam is about. What the examiner does, he sets up a question which says, here is a performance management system. Yeah, do we think this is an appropriate system in this situation? It's not so much asking you to describe what performance management systems are. It's talking about this exam. When is a particular performance management system, if you like, appropriate? Yeah, it's to do with an evaluation, if you like, of whether or not the performance management system is appropriate. And therefore, when you're studying, you need to think very hard, not so much about what something is. I mean, certainly you need to know how to do an incremental budget. What is activity-based costing? What is activity-based management? All that is true, but it's more to do, it's more examined, if you like, to do with when is it appropriate and what benefits it might be. Because the other angle to this is, rather than giving you an existing performance management system and asking you to evaluate it, what the examiner might do is say, here's a scenario, they've got an existing performance management system which isn't working, that's a given, if you like. And then he says, well, what about if we introduce something new? Is this a good idea? Would this work in this situation? And the entire exam is like that. The entire exam is exactly the same. Yeah, we use return on investment. Do you think it's a good idea in this scenario? We do incremental budgeting. Do you think this is a good way of doing things, or would zero basing be better, and why? It's all about adaptation and change, if you like, to a strategic process. Yeah. So that's what it's about, and that's what you've got. That's how you've got to think. Yeah. Now, what the examiner is trying to get you to be able to do is to be an accountant that's in business and recognize that is happening. So just reflect for a second. Think about where you work. Is there methodologies, things that you do that perhaps, you know, been there a long time, we repeat them month in, month out, but actually they're not great. They're not the right way of doing things in the current environment. Now you've got 60% of your people working from home. You know, what performance management changes would you like, if you like, you'd like to see? It's incredibly common. Do you produce monthly reports that actually are a bit pointless, that no one reads? It's quite a common situation. All of this, by the way, was when I launched my new business, which is only, you know, June or July 2020. I was just talking to Sam about that. When COVID came along and destroyed my business, I launched this. And I'm, you know, it's been successful. I'm doing very well, thank you very much. So but my first article published, if you like, was in the PQ magazine. That's on a website now called issue.com. I don't know whether you're familiar with that. You might well be. And therefore I produce this article, which just simply says, what's the examiner thinking? I mean, I don't know what the examiner's thinking. I do know the examiner. He's a friend of mine, but you know, we don't talk about that sort of stuff. We're not allowed. Quite morally correct. Yeah, but nonetheless, I do understand what he's trying to achieve. I'm absolutely certain. Yeah. So do have a read of the article. It's available in the issue.com. It was in August 2020, I think. Now, let's just fit together this distinction between Sbl and Apm. Because a lot of people come into APM thinking it's the same as Sbl, and of course it's not. Why could it possibly be the same? Why would the ACCA produce two exams the same? That's just crazy thinking, isn't it? And the left-hand side, I call this the performance hierarchy. It's the idea that on the left-hand side, you've got the basic decision of what strategy you're going to follow. What is going to be your unique selling point? On what basis are you going to be trading? And of course, all of that, without going into any detail particularly, all of that, if you like, is in the Sbl syllabus. And I'm not going to talk about it particularly because as far as the APM is concerned, all of that is given. Everything down the left-hand side, the strengths of the business, the mission, the objectives, the strategy, what exactly we're trying to do in detail, in specific terms, is given. And it's passed over effectively to the APM examining team and saying, right, how do we deliver this? So APM sits on the right-hand side of this performance hierarchy. In other words, you know, and there's three things here, isn't there? And only on this side, admittedly, you know, there's more to it clearly, where what is critical to our success, which I'm not going to talk much about because I've only got 2 hours and I've got to focus on what I think comes up more often. CSF is in the syllabus, but what is critical to our delivery of this strategy? And I've got a strategy, if you like, to deliver digital courses. What was critical to my success? Marketing was critical to my success. What you might describe as reach, outreach, being able to talk to people around the world. So I spent a lot of time and money developing my LinkedIn profile and reaching out to students around the world. I've gone from 600 connections, all of which were useless to me in terms of building my new business, to just short of 5,000 connections, 90% of which I know are current ACCA students. Right, so that was critical to my success, absolutely critical to my success. So that's what I focused on. There's obviously other things. I have to have good materials. I have to be able to be convincing when I deliver something. I have to have a flexible digital course, not a recorded 6-hour lecture course, because that's not a digital course. Right, so those are the things. So the critical success factors for me were things that will help me deliver. But how do I know I'm delivering them? Well, that's where KPIs come in. Because KPIs, if you like, is a way of measuring, whether or not you're delivering on your CSFs. So I decide that my CSF, if you like, is outreach. I desperately needed that. So what should I do? I should build up a KPI which says that within 2 years, I'm going to have 5,000 connections. So when I post on LinkedIn, I've got 5,000 people seeing my message. Otherwise, you're shouting in an empty room, aren't you? Now, in a larger business, it's not important in my business particularly because there is only me. But in a larger business, I would have staff and people working for me, and they would need to be rewarded. Now, wouldn't it be great if the reward system was consistent with the KPIs and the KPIs were consistent with the CSF? And that principle of consistency is what's examined. That's what's examined. So you will learn out of the textbooks what a CSF is. You will learn out of the textbooks what a KPI is. You'll learn out of the textbooks what a reward system is, and it's all hopeless. It's all useless to you, really, because what's important is, can you recognize inappropriate KPIs? Can you recognize unsuitable reward systems? And can you recognize when they are not consistent with the CSFs or the strategy? The way this is examined is all about consistency. So, for example, we've had questions in the past where CSF is given and the KPIs don't match them. Or we've had questions where the strategy is given, and the CSFs don't match them. And you've got to talk about that inconsistency, because it's all driven by this idea that the examiner thinks that the performance management system lags behind. Strategy changes because you have to survive, but your PMS system doesn't change. So they're inconsistent. And that's how it's tested. That's what the exam is all the time, every sitting. It's exactly the same. The precise content will shift, but the idea is always the same. Okay. Now, I know you've got these slides because I asked Sam to send them out in advance, so hopefully you can annotate, because otherwise you can't keep up, can you? Now, when we look at the exam then, therefore, it shouldn't be a surprise, given what I've just been saying, I suppose, that what's important, how this gets tested, if you like, is the fact that the evaluation and the suitability of the system is what is tested. Here is a scenario. They use this method. They use incremental budgeting. Is it appropriate? Or here is a scenario. They're thinking of adopting a new performance management system. Do you think it's suitable? And so learning from a book, the pros and cons will get you some way. You have to be super careful that you do apply yourself, which I'll talk about. The second way that this exam, I suppose, gets tested is one of justification. And it's very important that you appreciate why that is, in my opinion. Because if you understand why something is, then you accept it more readily, don't you, generally? Because what the examiner is trying to make sure is that you understand. And therefore, you can go into business and make up your make up your case, for change because you understand it. We can't do it like this, guys, because of this. So we can't use incremental budgeting because the business is subject to too much change. We can't do incremental budgeting because the staff are aware of that. They've been aware of that for years and they're now gaming the system. So you're not just, if you like, quoting bits out of the performance management syllabus, you genuinely understand. And what you've got to appreciate is that in management accounting, there's a big, it's very deregulated. There are no rules. There are no IFRSs. There is no tax law. Right. So if I said to you, business entertaining customers is not allowable for tax, that is true. I don't need to justify it because it's the law. Agreed? If you spend money on research and development to meet all these criteria, it can be capitalized. That is true. It's in the IFRS. I don't have to justify it. There's no why. Unfortunately, in APM, and in to be fair, the entire management accounting world, there is no regulation. Is there? So when you say something, that incremental budgeting is not appropriate here, that's just your opinion. And you have to be able to justify it. And the examiner examines justification incredibly commonly. So it's not just a case of you learning your list. You really do need to understand this, which is why I think cramming APM is such a mistake. People think they can cram exams, don't they? I've had someone on the exam results came out on Monday, didn't they? So I spent the last 48 hours in this room dealing with student queries, and the number of people that are saying to me, can I do APM in June starting now, is unbelievable. And the answer is no, not really. You'll really struggle because you've got to understand it. You can't just cram it and learn it, in my opinion. Yeah, September's a much better option if you're starting right now. Yeah. Then you've got this idea of application. How is it? Why is it tested like that? It's because when you change jobs, when you move into a different, department, can you be adaptable and recognize what they need as opposed to what the previous department and the previous job needed? And that's what APM is about. It's about evaluation, it's about justification, it's about application. And those three things, are what's driving the examiner. And so all the exam questions are driven like that, are written like that. They're all scenario. So you've got to apply yourself to the situation. And we'll talk about that in more detail. What we're going to do is look at these things one by one and then apply them to a specific examinable area. Okay, we're going to look at each of these. Now, evaluation is probably the most common, if you like, verb in the exam. Yeah, I can't say I've counted and measured that. Perhaps I should do, but I have done occasionally, and it certainly comes out, appropriate. Is something suitable, if you like, given the individual scenario? So what the examiner does, he sets up a business, and I sent you one around called Vunderg. I hope you've had a chance to read it. Yeah, you have to have read it. I did ask for that to happen, and Sam, I know, has done that. So I hope you've read it. Yeah, where, if you like, that business is a business that generates windows and conservatories and glass structures and so forth, and glass houses and so forth. And it's all very much driven by an explanation given in the question. And by the way, you don't have to take in knowledge about a particular business type. The examiner will always explain that. Yeah. And what you then got to do is either evaluate an existing system that's in there or propose new system. Now that, by the way, is not the same as merely listing the advantage and disadvantage of the system. That's not a bad way of doing it, but it's not the perfect way of doing it, because you might have learned advantages and disadvantages out of the book, but some of them might not be appropriate to this scenario. I don't know how many of you have studied economic value added. Have you studied EVA yet? Anybody studied EVA? Probably one of the favorite topics of the examiner, I think. We're overdue a question, by the way, in my opinion, although, because the ACCA don't publish all the papers, I don't know that's true anymore. It's really frustrating. I can't say for sure what came up in June because it's not been published. But EVA's very much, I think, overdue. I'm hearing no rumours that it came up recently. Yeah. And so you learn the advantage and disadvantage of EVA, and you might learn that an advantage of EVA is it's a more appropriate, if you like, measure of divisional performance because it reflects cash and growth and market value. So it's good. And yet the examiner years ago set up a question where most of the finance staff were unqualified. None of them had any training in EVA. Everybody was happy with the existing system. And so the examiner was pointing you down the line of EVA is no good in this situation. So your standard list of advantages and your standard list of disadvantages don't work. You have to be super careful with APM. You can't just learn a list out of the textbook. You have to properly apply yourself and say, well, look, in this particular circumstance, EVA is not appropriate for this reason. So just be super careful with learning standard lists. They're okay sometimes, but not always. In my view, when you're trying to evaluate a change, arguments in favor and arguments against is perhaps a better structure. The examiner might sometimes give you a clue of that, asking you for cost against benefit, for example. What are the costs of the change? What are the benefits of the change? Yeah, but generally it's arguments in favor and arguments against a system change is the way in which you should think about it in the exam. It's hard to learn like that, of course, because you don't know what the scenario is going to be. Yeah, what is very important is this, that the argument is much more important than the conclusion. So if I said to you that, I want you to make the case for introducing zero-based budgeting, say, for sake of argument, make the case for introducing zero-based budgeting in this particular situation, and I give you 8 marks for that, yeah, the argument will be worth 7, and the conclusion will be worth 1. So discussing the sort of situation and discussing the arguments both in favor and against that change is worth 7/8 of the mark, 80-something% of the mark. So in other words, it doesn't matter whether you get it right or wrong. It doesn't matter whether you conclude it is and then actually the examiner thinks it isn't, or vice versa. And that should be a comfort, really. You don't have to get it right. That's one of the big differences, I think, with APM compared to a lot of other papers. With tax, you have to get it right because there's a rule and there's a right and wrong answer. But in APM, it's not like that. The argument is much more important than the conclusion. So, hey, relax. You don't have to be right. You have to understand the arguments and balance that. And ultimately then, if you like, reach a conclusion. Now, because you're all doing June, I don't need to talk about the new professional skills marks in September. So I wasn't setting out to do anyway, but there is a new way of marking coming. Hopefully you'll never see it because you'll pass in June. That'd be lovely, wouldn't it? Now we're going to look now at this question Wunderg that I sent you in advance, or that Sam did. Yeah. And the requirement, if you like, is I'm now going to remove this. Just hold on a moment. I'm going to remove this participants panel here because surely no one's going to join now, so I can see the screen myself. Evaluate whether the introduction of activity-based management could help with the strategic performance of this business called Wunderg, which, as I mentioned already, they make windows and conservatories and glass houses, and they've got plans to do other things. And this was 13 marks. But look at the verb, yeah? Evaluate, introduction. So a new performance management system in this business, yeah? So you've got to apply yourself to this business. Now, you need some base knowledge, clearly. What do you know about activity-based management? Yeah, ABC is in the PM syllabus or the old F5 syllabus. ABC is also potentially testable in APM. I would accept that, but generally ABB or ABM is the, if you like, the senior subject, and that's, if you like, just reflects the progression that you get between F5 and P5 or PM and APM as in new money. So you learn about ABM, you learn about activity-based management. Clearly, your knowledge of ABC is important, but that then generates a conversation about activity-based management. Well, I know you've got the slides here, so I don't need to ask you the question effectively, yeah. But what do you know about activity-based management? You know, what knowledge have you got? Then what the examiner says is that there are very few marks for knowledge in this exam. You know, what the examiner says, actually, you can score 15% for demonstrating your textbook knowledge, but no more. So you cannot pass by just writing down everything you know about ABM. You can't pass by some long margin because it's all about application. But nonetheless, the things on the screen, if you like, is that are the principles of ABM. Yeah, which is that activities drive costs. Yeah, and we hope those activities are value adding. Perhaps in the chat panel, what does value adding mean? That's a fair question to put into a chat panel. Yeah, what is the concept of value adding? Value added activity. What's a value added activity? What does that mean? Well, let's think about that as we talk, because there's no doubt that if activity generates cost, maybe there are some activities that are generating too much cost. And the idea of activity-based management is to look for efficiencies, yeah, or alternative ways of doing an activity to make it a bit cheaper or to make it more effective. So ABC says, what's the cost for activity? Fine. Yeah, and that's an F5 or a PM topic. An APM idea is, well, hang on, can we do that differently? So if we're spending a lot of money on an activity, can we outsource, for example? It's not always very popular, that, is it? B&O Ferries in the UK just outsourced their seafaring staff and sacked everybody, and that's gone down really badly here, really badly, and the government are gunning for them. Yeah, and probably quite rightly, I suppose. Yeah, identifying non-value added activities. See, to my mind, the accountant can be responsible for that to some extent, in that, you know, producing a report that nobody reads is a non-value added activity. It is. Or carry out an activity that generates no value. So it doesn't mean necessarily sales price, but it means something that the customer value. There should be a customer focus to that. Non-value added activities include things like correcting errors. Waste is a non-value added activity. Doing things that don't add value as far as the customer is concerned. Sometimes customers aren't aware, admittedly, so it's value added from a regulatory point of view, but it's not value added from a customer point of view. And you can't, unfortunately, cut out regulatory activities, can you? Because you're required by law to carry them out. So every month you might have to do a report to government. That doesn't carry value to the customer necessarily, yeah, but you can't ignore it. So non-value-added activities can't always be removed, but some of them can be, and most of them should be. And then the textbook will also tell you that, you know, you might get some help with pricing decisions. So passing on activity-based costs to customers. Yeah, so customer rings me, yeah, and asks me to do something. Very often I do it for nothing, but sometimes I say, look, there's an activity involved here, and therefore there's a charge. A deferral, for example. I have to charge for deferral because it gives you 3 months extra access to my courses, and there's a cost involved in me to FME because I'm self-employed. I am genuinely self-employed. It's not one of these tax dodges. I am genuinely self-employed. So that's an activity that I have to charge, and you know, and students, generally speaking, accept that. It's not, it's not a big charge. I don't exploit anybody. So that, if you like, is what our textbook tells us. And if you wrote that down, and there's 13 marks here, just imagine this for a moment. Yeah. If you wrote that down, you wrote these 3 things down, how many marks do you think you'd get? On the chat panel, if you said activity-based costing, activity-based management could help Lundberg by 1, 2, 3, and you wrote all that down, how many marks do you think you'd get? Out of 13. In the chat panel, come on. The guess. But everything you said was correct. Tick, tick, and tick. We're giving 2, 3, 7. That's everything in the textbook. There's nothing else particularly. Google thinks 3. Alexa thinks it's right. 13. Blimey, you couldn't get more different answers, could you? 3 and 13. Because it's right and it's everything in the textbook, therefore correct. Yeah. And I think, Google, you're more likely to be right than 13. 15% of 13, if I pick up my calculator for a moment, 13 times 0.15 is 1.95, so 2. You might only get 2 or 3 marks because it's not applied. It's not applied to Lundberg. Where's the mention here of what Lundberg does? Where's windows or conservatories or things that they have mentioned in the question? It's not there, is it? So, Alexei, I'm afraid you're getting not very much for that, even though it's all right. That's the thing that people just don't appreciate sometimes. You've got to apply yourself. Yeah, and I'm going to show you how to do that. Right? You're much better, in my view, not to answer from the textbook. You've got to know this. Clearly, you've got to know this. I fully accept that. Yeah, but it's much better to answer from the question specifics. Now, remember, just think about this. I've been an examiner, so I know, not making this up. When I used to write exam questions, I would put things into the questions. I would always call them specifics. I'd put something into the question that I wanted people to recognize as relevant to my question and turn it round, give it me back with a bit of added value, and bingo, you score marks. And I was always very frustrated when they ignored that because I've had to imagine a situation. So what the examiner does, he wants you to come up with the points that are on the screen, but he wants you to do it in context. So these points are right, but can you find something in the question, some specific in the question that will enable you to say this, that makes it relevant? Yeah, and if you do that, oh my word, you score marks. Oh my word, the markers will absolutely love you. And your mark will go from, if you've taken this exam before, anyone taken this exam before? Anybody taken this exam before in the chat panel? Alexi's first attempt. Yeah, 36, says Rashmi. That's very, very open of you. Thank you, Rash. Yeah, not an uncommon mark, for people that self-study. You can't self-study APM. It's so difficult to you can't learn it. Got to get help. In my opinion, you can perhaps learn tax, you can perhaps learn SBR, maybe, but they're all applied to some extent, aren't they? Yeah. So when you look at Lundberg, and there's a little exercise for you to do in a moment, right? It says things like the Windows market is saturated, doesn't it? With many competitors and standard products. That's not just padding. That's the examiner giving you a hint that there's something in that sentence which will help you answer the question. It's the what in the so what. It's the bit in the question that is a specific thing that actually is useful to you if you add some value to be able to answer the question. And therefore, your comment that is coming from the textbook goes from getting half a mark to getting 2. I mean, it can turn a 36. It can turn a 36 into a 46 and a 56 really quickly, this technique. Yeah. And there's a note here from XH. Can you see it? How do we practice applying the knowledge from textbook if we don't have much relevant working experience? That is a real challenge of APM, I have to say. That's why you do it late. You need relevant working experience. I've seen people with working in charities, for example, who've really struggled with APM because they just don't have the practical knowledge. And I don't have an answer to that apart from get some help from the tutor who can give you some guidance, do some marking for you, suggest something. Yeah. Gosh, if you're working in a non-commercial environment, this exam becomes difficult because the ACCA are trying to protect the industry from people that are coming in not knowing what they're doing. So I'd have some sympathy for the ACCA in that regard, really. I don't want someone running a large commercial organization who's not got any experience. I think that's a bad idea. So you need to get that experience somehow. Yeah, secondments, don't know. Read. Yeah, get a good quality newspaper and read it every morning. I subscribe to the Times and I read it every single day, business pages. Half an hour, I whiz through the business pages, and it gives you knowledge and it gives you experience. Yeah, marking is part of the answer, of course. Yeah. Then we've got glass houses involve suppliers' orders vary in size and complexity. And again, if you don't have the experience, you might not see the connection between that and an ABM point, which I'm going to make for you in a moment. We're told that conservatories are bespoke and made to measure and involve a lot of customer support and design. What does that apply to ABM? That's activity, isn't it? Lots of support and design, made to measure, customers asking for things. That's activity, causing and creating time and causing and creating costs. And maybe the customer should pay for that. And that's why that sentence is in the question. But you've got to realize, again, that the examiner is writing these things, wanting you to recognize them, turn them around, add some value, score marks. Not just score 1, but score 2. I mean, score really heavily. The basic rule is that you get a mark per point, but if it's a well-made point, you can get 2. Large windows are a new product, it says. And maybe that's a hint towards the pricing. We'll see in a minute. The procurement department spends a long time sourcing materials. This is not just padding in the question. People who read these questions and think it's just background are deluding themselves. You need to recognize this is important. Every sentence has something in it, potentially. Fault rectification is common, mainly leaks. What's that? What's that a hint towards? Fault rectification in an activity-based management environment. What's that? What's the examiner trying to get you to do? Why has he put that sentence in? Because don't forget, the examiner sat there in his office working on a question, and your June paper was written 18 months ago, by the way, 15 to 18 months ago. There was huge lead time in the ACCA. They're very organized as an organization. I know. Yeah. Why has he put that in? Because that's non-value added, isn't it? Isn't it? And then there's a basic IT system. Why is that there? Is that a problem for ABM when you haven't got a decent IT system? Well, yes, because they won't be able to identify the cost drivers. It won't work, will it? And so that's what the examiner does. He gives you clues, specifics in the question. And all you need to do then is to take each specific. Yeah, excuse me. This is a brand new presentation, so my annotation's gone wrong there. Take each specific and add an argument to evaluate the ABM's usefulness. So this was the first point that we picked up, wasn't it? Yeah, and all I've then said is, well, that means the market will not tolerate price rises because the market is saturated. And the point about ABM sometimes is that you can pass on to customers additional pricing for activity. Well, no, you can't. No, you can't, because there's lots of alternative. Yeah, there are. If you like, have you heard? Do you remember this? There are 3 C's in pricing. What are they? You've heard of the, this is a more of a F5 or a PM knowledge. What are the 3 C's of pricing? What are the 3? Remember this? It's not in the APM syllabus, but it is background. What are the 3 C's of pricing, guys? What 3 factors determine a price? 3 words beginning with C. Something I think the examiner would expect you to know. I'm going to wait. What are the 3 C's of pricing, do you think? Things that you think about that determine the price of something that you're charging to customers. Cost, competition, good. Because obviously what, and customers is the third one. Good, so your knowledge is good of these sorts of things. Yeah, and so one of the C's of pricing is cost. And so if a window manufacturer asks for something specific, it costs more, therefore we can pass it on to price. Well, that's a lovely idea. The problem is if the competition, yeah, and the customer factor is strong, increasingly it is, you won't be able to pass those costs on. Yeah, I'm about to breach the VAT threshold for my business. If I do that, then all my sales values will go up by 20%. Here's the bad news. The customers that I have are not VAT registered. They will not tolerate that price increase, and therefore I will not be able to do that. So my revenue will be deemed gross, and I will lose 20,000 UK pounds, just like that. So I've got to find a way around that, and I have. Because educational businesses, when they're sole traders, are exempt and VAT threshold. Hooray, thank goodness. But it means a big reorganization of a business as a result. So pricing isn't just about cost. Just because my costs go up doesn't mean I can always pass it on. Sometimes it does. Yeah. So what about this? Glass houses involve suppliers orders which vary in size and complexity. There's the, if you like, the fact in the question. There's the specific in the question. Couldn't I then say that complex process could perhaps be simplified using ABM? ABM, one of the principles of ABM is that can you find a more efficient way of doing something? So why don't we try and find a way of not varying in size and complexity of the supplier's orders and simplifying the supplier process, and maybe the cost will come down. That's why that sentence is there. It's giving you a context for the point that you want to make. Yeah. Observatories are bespoke and made to measure. Why is that there? Bespoke and made to measure conservatories. How would ABM help us, if you like, in that situation? Couldn't we pass that cost on to customers? There's an exercise for you to do in a moment. I've built one in. But that's how it goes. What you're doing effectively, I sometimes think this, I think this first sentence is the what in the question, and this second sentence is the so what that you have to add. I call it what, so what, or sometimes I'm going to repeat myself later here, but given this, then this. And if you can identify the givens and put an added value of the then you score pots of marks, and your 36 turns to 56 in an instant, because the entire exam is like this. Everything's like this. Large windows are a new product. Well, we know from our textbook that getting the price right, ABM can help us. Okay, we'll just say that ABM could help get the price right on this new bespoke product. The procurement department spends a lot of time sourcing materials. You could take various routes there. You could say maybe it's inefficiently done, yeah, and therefore the system could be simplified, and that will save us money, and that's how ABM will help. So it's therefore ABM is a good idea in this business because it's got this feature. Not ABM is a good idea for everybody. This is what the examiner is trying to avoid. And fault rectification, as I mentioned before, is not a value-added activity, is it? A value-added activity is something that the customer values and can see, or is required by regulation, because effectively it prevents, it prevents a fine. It's required. It's not really about price or profit. It's a more long-term concept. I would suggest to you. Why is me writing articles for the PQ magazine and others a value-added activity for my business? I think it builds brand and reputation. It doesn't necessarily make an extra sale today, but I think it will do that in the long term. It builds credibility, doesn't it? Doing that sort of thing. And doing things like this equally is the idea of, from my point of view, is I build some credibility and to help out our friends, the ACCA. There's a twin aim in that. I'm quite clear about that. Yeah. This basic IT system is like almost the first negative here, because ABM isn't appropriate if you haven't got the information, and maybe we haven't got the data to identify the drivers and work out the cost per driver. And actually, the basic IT system is in place in many years. The examiner puts that in quite a lot to say sometimes what might be described as legacy systems are understood and popular. And people are pretty resistant to change, aren't they? If you had to change something that you're routinely doing, would you agree you'd find that difficult? It's not a popular thing to have to do, is it? Now, what I've done there is taken Wunderg and hopefully explained how you add value, how you answer a question, evaluate in a given, if you like, in a given situation. Yeah, this idea of what and so what. So I give you a specific in the question. Yeah, the so what is an implication that's driven by the requirement. It's a really important skill. Yeah, and it turns your attempt at a 25 mark question, which you scored 7, it'll turn it to 14 in an instant, because everything you're saying, it's rare in APM that people say things that are technically wrong, because it's not, APM isn't hard. If I said to you, what do you think about profit-based bonus schemes? I'm sure you could say things about it that is technically correct, but are you answering the question is another matter. And that's why you need a tutor, because you need to get help, if you like, on answering the questions and gaining that experience, as somebody mentioned earlier. It came up as XH, so I'm not quite sure. Not quite sure who you are. I'm sorry. Zai, is it? I've got that right. I'm sorry if I've got that wrong. Yeah. No. Hang on, someone's just coming in, believe it or not. Let's just do it. Let's move on. Look, we've had an hour. I am tempted for just a 5 minute, comfort break. It's a good performance management principle, I have to say. We can't keep on going for 2 hours without a stop. So I'm just thinking 5 minutes might be a good idea. Okay. So it's now 9:05 roughly at my end. If you just take 5 minutes, nip to the loo, go and get yourself a cup of coffee, whatever. Come back at 10 past the hour. I don't think we're in half hours. I think from what I heard before, and we'll carry on. Just a 5 minute, because we've only got a 2 hour session, but 5 minutes just to refresh up, get a cup of coffee, come back. I'll see you in 5 minutes. Thank you. I was chatting quite happily to myself. Right, I'll go back. I do apologize. Now, I chose KPIs. Because I think it's the most important part of any exam. It can be easily 15-20% of an individual paper. It can come up in a couple of different questions. It's really, really important. Yeah. And it's possible then, therefore, that this will feature in June. And your base knowledge, I suppose, is, what makes a good performance measure. Not that you'll be asked that question, because you'll be asked to evaluate an existing performance measure, probably, or maybe suggest some new ones. Those are the two types of question that you might get. Okay. Now, first point I would say very briefly is, as I've mentioned already, it needs to be consistent with Mission and CSFs. And in fact, that's one of the very easy marks. So they'll mention something in the mission or they'll mention something in the objective, but there's no corresponding KPI. It's a gap. Very common, very common. It's almost like disjointed thinking. So you have an objective to develop staff, but actually there's no KPI which does that, doesn't measure. So how do you know, how do you know you've achieved that? It's just one of these throwaway mission statements or throwaway objectives that isn't, taken seriously. Okay. Or there might be a CSF for which there isn't a corresponding KPI, or it's an inappropriate KPI. It doesn't actually deliver on the CSF. Consistency is very easy marks. Yeah. Secondly, it needs to be specific, right? So a bad KPI, would be to say something like, we need to deliver better performance or world-class performance. And that's not as good as something specific like better profit. Not that I think profit is necessarily a good measure, but it's better than better performance. I think vague and general statements like performance, learning, improvement doesn't mean anything. You need to say what you're improving and what you're learning. A KPI really also, needs to be measurable. You need to be able to put a number on it. So better profit is actually no good. You want to be saying something like 10% more profit. And by the way, this number is obviously relevant because, a KPI also, needs to be achievable, doesn't it? And maybe an adding profit of 10% seems reasonable, but adding 100% more profit perhaps is unreasonable. Clearly, what is achievable to some extent, I suppose, would you agree, is a little bit judgmental. Yeah, if I ask you to do 20 press-ups and if you're a young, fit person, maybe you can do that. If I said do 500 press-ups without stopping, I think most people would find that tough. I don't think I can do that. I might be able to do 50, suppose, but I might hurt for a week as a result. But you need, whatever happens, it needs to be achievable, and you need to exercise your judgment. You need to be brave in this exam, because he wants to know, this examiner, whether you've got good judgment. Otherwise, your KPIs will be unreasonable for staff. Ideally, a KPI, I think it is better to be a driver of performance than the outcome or the result of performance, ideally. So profit actually is not a great KPI, because just watching profit doesn't necessarily make more profit, does it? Do you understand that? What is generating my profitability in my business is, let's say, the number of students or the type of product that they're buying. These are drivers of my revenue. And that is true of all businesses. And measuring drivers as opposed to results, is a better way of running a business, in my opinion. So you need to think about what's driving performance. And again, that person that said in before, I have no commercial experience, then that's a problem. I'm not saying move jobs particularly, but you need to read. You need to read decent newspapers, decent business newspapers. not the Mirror or the Sun or whatever local rag you might read now and again. Yeah. So, you know, saying 10% more profit might be fine, but saying 10% more customers is better, because more customers leads to more revenue, and that leads to more profit. Be super careful in a KPI system that you only have a single KPI in an area, because the moment you've got a single KPI, it's very easy to manipulate. So if I said to you, you were working in a car garage, sales garage, so you're selling cars, and I said, you get a bonus if you sell more than 5 cars in a week. Is that okay? One KPI, sell cars. What bad thing could happen in the chat panel if I gave you that as a KPI? Your KPI is to sell cars 1 a day, 5 in a week. Yeah, school says, well, I'll just sell them cheaper. You have to think quite deviously in APM, Gil, because the staff will think deviously. They might give away free servicing. So you sell a car, but you're making no money. So one KPI, one single KPI in an individual area is never any good, in my opinion. The chances are you'll always need one on cost or revenue, and then another one on quality. So just think about that. Have one, if you like, on the cost or the revenue, and then another one on the quality of provision. And if you have 2 like that, they tend to act as a bit of a scale and stop people manipulating things. The flip side of that is if you have too many KPIs, staff get confused about what's important. I don't know whether you guys have any KPIs on you as an individual in the office. I mean, I don't know. Do you? How many targets do you have? And the chances are there's not many, and the chances are they're all too vague anyway. It's group profit or divisional profit, and they're just rubbish as TSK. What difference does it make to you as an individual is what's important, right? So if I task a food buyer to buy cheaply, can you agree that that just risks the buyers buying without consideration of quality? I buy fish that's a bit old because it's cheap. Yeah, and most exams will ask for multiple KPIs per CSF area. I say multiple, to be honest, 2 is the norm. One on financial and one on non-financial is not a bad way of doing that. Equally, KPIs, sometimes you might want them an absolute, and sometimes you might want them as a relative thing. Yeah, deaths on a building site, 0. Maybe an absolute is, can you imagine the political fallout for saying, oh well, we accept 5% of people will die on this building contract. I mean, I have limited experience in building contracts, but I know that people die. But equally, I think the target should be no one dies. No one dies building this bridge. Would seem to me to be, I'm afraid, inevitable, even though it might be unachievable because somebody might die. Building areas are dangerous places. But something like complaints, 0 complaints is silly. An absolute number is also silly because as you grow, it gets more unachievable. So when I had in my first season, I had 7 students going back 18 months, 7. How many complaints would I want? I mean, I wouldn't want 1, because that's 14% of my population, isn't it, for goodness sake? And I should be able to keep 7 people happy, shouldn't I? Yeah, but as I've grown, because I've now got 35 or 40 on my revision course starting next week, then a percentage might be more sensible on the argument that you can't keep all of the people happy all of the time. Sometimes people can complain for all sorts of bizarre reasons. Yeah, I've seen people complain on Amazon because what was delivered wasn't appropriate, even though that's what they ordered, which is just crazy. What they're talking about. So people so getting 0 complaints would be very difficult because people can complain about some very odd things. But maybe you'd want, 2% of customers to complain only. You'd want less than that, right? But, you know, a percentage or a relative measure might be sensible. What makes a good KPI system? There's got to be a system. There's got to be data. There's got to be a system to back it up, you know, and it's got to be cheap enough to gather the information. It's not got to be too complicated. These are all very sensible things to say. You don't want to be asking people in a football ground one by one as they leave, did they enjoy the game? That's just unworkable. It would result in chaos and would be hideously expensive. Indeed, you don't want to ask everybody in a population anything, because that is also very expensive, and the variety of answers that you get mean that the analysis becomes a bit silly. Governments do that. We just had what they call a census here, but it's very rare, once every 5 years. It's not a routine thing. Principles of responsibility are very important. So when you create a KPI, someone should be responsible for it. No point in creating a KPI that just sits in the ether. Yeah, so your customer services manager is responsible for the contentedness of your customer base. Fair enough. Right, but the person making the product isn't responsible for the contentedness of the product of the customers. You're just making the product. So maybe you should target yourself something specific that is controllable by them. Agreed? So I create video, I then send it to FME for rendering. I am in control and responsible for the quality of the video that's recorded, but the rendering is someone else's responsibility, and they should be targeted for that. Some really important words on that screen. Oh my word. And KPI questions are easy, because all you need to do is say these sorts of things over and over. Responsibility, control, complexity, fairness. Yeah. Now to apply that, yeah, again, the most common way it's examined is like an evaluation. And if a KPI fails any of the things I've just mentioned, then it's weak. And by the way, you know, a KPI, evaluate a KPI, could be worth 4 marks. 4 marks for one KPI evaluation. And it's not about whether you think it's good or bad, i.e. the conclusion. It's about the argument that's important, right? So what about this? What about this? Supposing I say to you, a taxi business is a mixture of vehicles. They have some medium-sized vehicles to larger people carriers carrying 12 people. So you've got saloons and you've got the bigger carriers. Some are diesel and some are hybrids. No petrol. Most passengers simply want to arrive safely. They're not worried about arriving quickly. A lot of people are nervous passengers. All the common sense in this exam, by the way, and even if you haven't got commercial experience, you can have common sense. Nobody wants a taxi driver racing around. So that's the context. Okay. There's the KPI. Average litres of fuel per kilometres travelled for all vehicles. And you get 3 or 4 comments out of that. Because with KPIs, guys, you don't just have to be reasonable with them. You need to be good, because this is coming up in June. Every exam has KPIs in it. Can you pick that apart? Yeah. And I think what I did here is I've got one that I will do now, and then I've got one for you to think about, I think. I'm sure that's what I did. Yes, I did. Right. So I'm going to talk about this one. What about this? Can I get, you know, like 3 or 4 comments? First thing I'd say is using litres of fuel, would you agree, is a fuel efficiency measure? And I think that would encourage the drivers, wouldn't it, to drive more sensibly? And that is good for us because it could save us money. I'm not, by the way, I'm thinking here, not an Uber type business. I'm thinking about a taxi business that, you know, has drivers and it takes the profit and pays the drivers a wage, something like that. That was in my mind when I created that. In an exam environment, the context would be explained in more detail. So it's a good efficiency measure, and I think therefore that's a good thing about that KPI. Yeah, I think also, given I've got an objective to arrive safely but not quickly, fuel economy is sort of consistent with that, isn't it? Because, you know, you'll drive slowly if you've got to conserve fuel. I went from here to North Manchester on Monday to visit my grandchildren. I drove there sensibly, 65 miles an hour, something like that, about 90 kilometers an hour. Coming back, I wasn't quite so sensible, I have to say. I might have been doing 95 miles an hour most of the way because I need to get back quickly. I didn't work this out exactly, but I reckon I used about 25% more fuel coming back than I did going. Yeah, so clearly arriving safely but not quickly is fuel efficient, and I think that's consistent with that KPI. It's good. But think about the mathematics, and that's always, by the way, quite a good advice. Do you like this calculation average when you've got medium and larger carriers, diesel and hybrids? There's something in data analysis called segmentalization. The idea that your population must be segmented into suitable populations before you do any calculations. And an average always betrays that principle, always. So the examiner expects you to be data knowledgeable. Quite right, you're accountants. Goodness sake, we must be good with numbers. We absolutely must. And in the new syllabus in September, data analytics is coming. And that's entirely right. I think I have a lot of time for this examiner. He is a pal of mine. I think he's got that right. And I think the ACCA have got that right. I don't think they've gone far enough. I would make you all very good at data, because you should be. Yeah. And averages are very poor in a dispersed population, because every vehicle type is different. A change of mix of vehicles would change the KPI, wouldn't it, without changing the fuel efficiency? So in other words, you get a lot more electrical vehicles. The average fuel used per car would go down. Doesn't mean the cars are being driven more safely, does it? Because you're just changing the type of vehicles. The target should be different depending on the type of vehicle, in my opinion. And if you don't get that, it's because you're not good enough at data. You need to recognize subpopulations and deal with them. Right? So, one for you to have a look at in the chat panel. What about this? Can you think of 3 sensible things to say? Can you think of 3 sensible things to say? Percentage of drop-offs. So you pick up someone and then you drop them off, and the drop-off within 3 minutes of the estimated figure. Perhaps I should have said time there. So you get in and you say to the driver, when will we get there? And they say 9:50 a.m., sir or madam. And we've got a target to drop them off within 3 minutes of that time. So it's now, if you like, 9:10 a.m. We've estimated we're going to drop them off at 9:50. It's a 40-minute journey, therefore, roughly. I mean, it'll vary, of course. What can you think of to say in the chat panel? This is one for you to think about. You can't just say, yes, it's okay, or no, it's not. We need an argument, don't we? What do you think? Now, I know you've got I know you've got the answers in front of you, but I want you to experience, if you like, the dilemma here. How can you think of 4 things to say there? I mean, oops. That's a good idea, says Rashmi, as it involves risk, the driver might speed up. It's a good point, isn't it? I mean, don't forget the overall objective is to arrive safely, not quickly. And if you get delayed in the journey at all, which, I mean, of course you can, can't you? My wife, Sarah, drove my stepson, Finn, down to Bournemouth from here, which is 500-600 miles, on Good Friday last weekend. The M6 was closed. The main motorway was closed, completely closed, and added an hour and a half to the journey, completely outside their control. So guess what? I think a little bit of speeding might have been done towards the end of the journey to catch up, as Rashmi's just said. So it might encourage them to speed. Yeah. Anything else? That, by the way, Rashmi, is why sometimes targets get varied when things that are outside of your control happen. That's the concept, if you like, of planning. Remember, planning and operational variance is the idea that something happens that's outside of your control. We need to reflect that in a new target. That's where rolling budgets come from, where the idea that you roll forward a little bit. See, I would say that if it's coming from an estimated sat-nav, maybe that has existing traffic conditions and it makes it a fair target. The first thing to say is the target reasonable? But then, of course, surely unexpected events can happen outside the control. Remember, we talked about this word controllability in what makes a good KPI. You don't control other drivers and you don't control driving conditions, do you? Could snow. You don't get snow in Australia very much. I don't, maybe you do. It's New Zealand. I've been to New Zealand. You've got a glacier. I had my honeymoon in New Zealand. I rode a motorbike around the South Island for a week. We had 2 weeks. We had glorious weather. It was so lucky. Yeah. 3 minutes. I don't know. That seems pretty small margin of error, possibly unachievable. I know we always play the game of beating the sat nav. Yeah, but if your journey was 4 hours long and the tolerance was only 3 minutes, I think you'd probably think that was quite tight. If your journey is 5 minutes long and your tolerance is 3 minutes, that's probably okay. So it would seem to me that what's wrong with this target is it's an absolute and it should be a percentage, shouldn't it? Because then the longer journey would get a longer tolerance, which seems to be very sensible. Equally, there's other things that can happen. The drop-off point might be changed. That makes the target irrelevant, of course. Can you see how you just got to think about what might go wrong? Is there anything outside of our control? Is it achievable? Is it measurable? And you can make comments on it and you can score good marks. So if you in your exam, when you got 30-odd%, Rashmi, if you got an evaluate the KPI, yeah, maybe you'll see that differently. I don't know. Maybe now you can score 10, not 2. These comments make a huge difference to people's marks. Huge, absolutely huge. So the thing is, if you look in a textbook at KPIs, all it says is what was on the screen before. Got to be controllable, got to be system, got to be reasonable, got to be achievable, blah, blah, blah. But that doesn't help you answer the exam question. So when I wrote my materials, including my revision notes, I tried to write them relevant to the examiner. That's risky. When the examiner retires, I might have to retire. I have to rewrite all my materials. But standard textbooks just don't cut it, in my opinion, because they don't approach it, if you like, from the way the examiner approaches it. They approach it from the syllabus. That's not necessarily a mistake, but that's what courses are for in some ways. Right. Let's look at justification briefly. I think that's probably fair to do. I'm pretty sure that the examiner wants you to understand performance management principles so that when you go to a new location, you can justify your suggestions. Yeah, he also thinks, of course, that most organizations are doing the wrong thing and not responding to change. So you need to make the argument. You need to be able to justify the change. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, most accountancy is driven by rules. That is not true of management accounting and performance management. There's lots of rules in IFRSs and Companies Acts and tax legislation, but in performance management and management accounting, that's not the case. There are no rules. So what the examiner is trying to do here is make sure that you understand. So when you're learning, make sure you can explain and justify your statements. He mentions this in the examiner's reports constantly. He gets very upset by people making unjustified statements. So by way, of examination, I mean, it can be directly tested, because sometimes he'll say produce a KPI and fully justify, and it's 3 marks per KPI, it might be only half a mark for the KPI itself, and it's 2.5 marks for the justification. Yeah, but it is actually also a silent threat. In other words, you make statements that you feel are correct, but because you haven't justified, you don't score as well as you could. So if I said to you in a tax exam, as I mentioned before, I think that business entertaining is not allowable. You don't have to justify that because that's the law. But in APM, unfortunately, you could be saying correct things, but you're not scoring because you're not justifying. So if I said salary-based reward systems fail to motivate, it's just that. I think that's probably true to some extent. If you're on a $40,000 salary, I don't know what salary levels are like in Australia, and I have no idea, or for that matter, Vietnam or China or wherever you're from, and I say salary levels, salary reward systems don't motivate, that might be true in your mind, but unless you say Synthes is paid regardless of effort, you're not justifying yourself. You reflect on that for a second. That means everything that you say in this exam, you've got to be super careful to say something and justify. ABC can lead to the better control of overhead. I bet everybody in this room has said that. And it's true. But it's better to say, look, because you understand the cost drivers, you can get cost efficiencies and cost savings. We understand what's driving cost. ABC, therefore, can lead us to affect those drivers and reduce the cost. Can you see how, again, those people that have struggled with this exam, and it won't just be one person that confessed, APM's got, a notoriously poor pass rate, hasn't it? I think this time in March, I think it was 33% of everybody that did it pass, that was all. So that might be worth a half, but if you add this explanation, you're getting an extra 1. You're tripling your marks from a half to 1.5. Yeah, worst case, you get an extra half, so you double your marks every sentence you write down. This justification is really quite a problem because you don't feel you need to justify statements like ABC can lead to better control of overhead, do you? Because that's what you've read in the book, and it's true. But the examiner is interested in justification, so be careful. If they ask you to justify, you simply have to do it, clearly. But if you're providing an evaluation of something, you better justify as you go along. Otherwise, you're just quoting out of the book. Yeah? So I know that's true. A central database will reduce duplications of data. But what would you say to justify? Can you add a half sentence on the end of that to justify that statement? I'm pretty sure it's true. You can put something in the chat panel if you wish. It's driven, isn't it, by the idea that if you've got disparate systems, data will be recorded in both systems. Have you heard of data silos? Coming up in the new syllabus in September. It's not really much in it, really. Yeah, but the idea that you've got one department, another department, both recording something, an employee's age or an employee's start point, then you're going to have duplication, aren't you? And a central database will remove that because the individual system will no longer exist. So just be super careful. Why is that true? Performance reports should have appropriate comparators. All you need to do is add a half sentence, something on the end here, and it converts a half to an extra half because you're justifying what you're saying. And you have to get into this habit because performance management is an unregulated environment. Yeah, so Rashmi's saying to compare relative performance. You need, don't you, a benchmark, a basis for performance. So if I said, you know, your gross profit percentage is 20%, but against what? How do you know 20% is good? You don't, do you? Without an appropriate comparator, you have no basis for commenting on performance. And by the way, you know, that's one way of achieving this justification, by giving a little example. So Rashmi's saying you could compare budget to actual, for example, or you could compare relative performance of two divisions, whatever. And an example can certainly do that. Yeah. So a quick exploration of the problem of justification. Be willing when you're studying to think about the why of something. Why is either better than ROI? Yeah, why is zero basing sometimes better than incremental? Why? And when you're studying, I think what tends to happen, certainly if you're studying on your own from textbooks, what you'll tend to focus on is the what and not the why. And you'll focus on the what and not the when. And that's I think, in my view, that's the book's fault. The book isn't good enough. You know, and so, you know, again, when I wrote my material, I was very vexed with this idea of when and why, and that was in my mind when I'm writing my words, because that's how it's tested. Obviously, you need to know what, but you need to know why, and you need to know when. Are these things appropriate? Yeah. Now, lastly, yeah, we're going to talk about application. We've done that a little bit with Bunderg, admittedly. Yeah. Is a new or existing system good in the existing scenario? Yeah, in this business is what we're interested in. Yeah, it's really important that you do that. The textbook will provide some background knowledge, admittedly, but you know, you must address specifics in the question, as we did with Bunderg. But that comes across everywhere. Okay, so for example, supposing I gave you a business called Fox Limited, right, and they sell age-restricted drugs. I'm not quite sure what they are, but oh gosh, when paracetamol is an age-restricted drug, for that matter, something you can't give to the children, right? And I gave you this. Sales managers, reward systems are an incredibly common examining tool. You don't need to learn about it. You know how people get paid. You need to understand the weaknesses in different ways of people that are being paid to people. And they've got a modest salary with the hope of substantial bonus. They can earn 25% extra, says there, yeah, from sales revenue-based bonuses. Bonus targets set by the board emphasize on past factors, and they need to continuously improve. Lots of little hints in this. The targets are demanding, and sales managers rarely get more than their 40% of their maximum bonus. Right now, learning about reward systems doesn't necessarily answer this question. What do you think about that reward system? It's another evaluation, but reward systems is one of the areas that I chose, yeah, to talk about, along with activity-based management, along with KPIs, and now rewards that are very, very commonly examined in APM. Not every time. KPIs virtually every time. Rewards incredibly common. Yeah, and I wanted you to talk about the methodology. Really, you need to pick out the specifics in the question. So you need to read that paragraph, which you won't have read before. Bunderg was different. I sent you that. This was in the pack, but you won't have read it. You need to read that question and see what specifics there are to be able to comment and have a view. Yeah, so pick out the specifics, add value, add an implication, add an interpretation to each specific point selected. Yeah, so for your own, if you like, benefit, have a look at that paragraph and tell me how many individual points you think there are. I mean, this evaluation of a reward system could easily be 6 marks. Could be more, could be 8 marks. I could make that an 8 marker, I think, even though it's only a short scenario. Where are the specifics? Which bits of that do you think are worthy of a comment or a mark? Just go through and underline for yourselves and tell me how many in the chat panel you think there are. How many sentences could you construct? This is super important, guys. A lot of people look at that, come up with 2 points, get 3 marks, fail. You can pick up 5 or 6 marks, 5 or 6 points, you're going to pass. You can have a dramatic effect on performance here. So in the chat panel, how many points do you think there are? How many areas? So Rasmi's saying this, we need to comment. Yes, I agree with you. It's a big number, that, isn't it? 25% extra wage. Use your judgment. I agree with that, Rashmi. That's good. It's very motivating, that. quarter extra. What else, guys? Come on. There is loads of stuff in there. What else? Demanding targets. Targets are demanding. That might mean unachievable, of course, not achievable. But it's a point worth commenting on, isn't it? Aleskit, the bonus is set by the board. Good, set by the board, dictated to. That's why I wrote it. It's not flannel. Flannel, it's not background padding. Every sentence in there is loaded full of stuff for you to pick up and add value and score. This is how you pass this exam. This is how you do it. You answer it from the question. Look, it's based on past factors. Who thinks that's a good idea? Since when is the past the future? Our targets are based on the past. Well, maybe it has to be, but the future's a very different place, isn't it? They only or rarely get more than 40%. How disheartening is that? So rather than 25, yeah, 0.25 times 0.4, I'm only getting 10% of that. That can't be right. Oh yeah, 10% out of 25. That's right. Sorry, that's right. Yeah. Don't skip over stuff. Only sales revenue. Any comments on that? What do you think about sales revenue-based business bonuses? Can you see you have to have this questioning, challenging mindset? What's wrong with that? What's going to happen if you set targets based on sales revenue alone? One ignores cost, don't they? Have a party. It doesn't matter as long as the client signs. And it's revenue, not margin. So again, margins can be squeezed. Oh, well, you got ahead of me there. Just, yeah. So if I was looking at the specifics and adding value, you know, the specifics, not all you do in the exam, of course, and this is where unfortunately doing exams on CBE is awkward. And doing the exams in an exam center, I have to say, in my opinion, is slightly beneficial because you've got loose paper. And I think I'm right in saying with remote invigilation, you haven't. And that's a bit of a disadvantage in my humble opinion. I understand why that has to be. Otherwise, how can the remote invigilated person check whether you've got something already written on your paper? So it's stopping you cheating, isn't it? But if you're doing the exams in an exam center, you can write these things down. In an exam, and in remote invigilation, what you do is you just jot these down as bullet points as you're reading the question, and then add a comment. So I can't demonstrate that particularly, but you know, jot down modest salary, make a comment. Jot down bonus potential, make a comment. Can you see if you work on rewards as a topic from the textbook and the syllabus, how much benefit is it to answering this question? And the answer is not much, because the specifics in the question is what he wants you to talk about. You need to know what revenue-based bonuses are. You need to know what these words mean. But to be honest, you could answer this exam regardless of that, couldn't you? The bonus potential is likely to motivate. Boards set the targets. That's not fair because there's no discussion. It could make staff resentful. The target is based on the past. The past is not the future. Revenue will then ignore cost. The maximum is rarely achieved. They'll get irritated. This is easy. This is easy. Yeah. Comment. Sorry. Pick up the fact. Make a comment. Pick up the fact. Make a comment. What? So what? Given, then. And in some ways, what sometimes people do is they copy and paste from the question into the answer, say board set targets, and then just as a little subheading, and then underneath it, write their answer. That works quite well, actually. Markers like it. Just got to be careful it doesn't become disjointed and look a bit false. But, you know, this becomes a little heading, little subheading, and then this then becomes your answer. That works really well. And it forces you to apply yourself to the exam. A few minutes left. I was just going to make some points here about how you prepare, right? Because what I've tried to do there in that 2 hours is talk about, I suppose, key skills to doing this exam, and we've applied them to KPIs, and we've applied them to rewards, and we've applied them to activity-based management as 3 individual subjects, right? But these key skills of application, the ability to read, the ability to communicate, yeah, are important. And you want to make sure that if you do buy a course from anywhere, they're not merely assumed. It drives me insane when tutors say, well, you must apply yourself without telling you how to do that, which is why, I produce an application skills section, a video on my course. You need some, wherever you go, wherever you go for your college or your course or your digital thing, ask yourself, well, are they teaching the skills? Yeah. Do you know how to properly read a question in APM? Because let me tell you, it's more important than any other paper, with the possible exception of SBL, because that's SBL and APM have similar skills. And it's very important, in my view, that wherever you go, you are taught these skills, how to use test reach, not just assumed. Yeah, this is quite interesting, because one of the common complaints I get, and something for you guys to think about, is, do you know the difference between performance management, and performance measurement? The stronger students always get that, but the weaker students don't. And do you understand the differences between those 3 things? And to my mind, that's an important skill, and it's not assumed. You've got to be able to do that. So I've produced an example, a report, and a video and stuff to do that. This is largely irrelevant now, because I now realize you're all doing June. Yeah, so I'm not going to talk about this particularly, but revision could take about 4 weeks, and then a week for a mock exam, and then a week to wrap up. And that's the way that I would tend to operate. So if you're doing the exam in June, when's the time to start revision? Next week, next Monday, or at the latest, the Monday after. So its time is very much pressing. I don't think anyone's doing September, and that's another matter. To me, if you're doing September, you need to be thinking about 10, 11, or 12 weeks. So for the next exam that you do in September, unfortunately, that means you have to start within 2 weeks of doing the exam in June. You can't wait for results. There isn't enough time, unfortunately. And you just simply can't cram APM. It's so difficult, because it's not something that you can learn. You have to understand it for all the reasons that I've talked about today. Sam told me that you're all pretty tech savvy when it comes to remote invigilation. You've been doing sort of like that sort of exam quite a long time because of the distances involved in some cases in some countries in the area. If I say this right, ASEAN, is that right? To say that right? Asia, Southeast Asia, anyway, New Zealand, Australia. ASEAN, sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry. ASEAN. Why isn't it ASEAN? Anyway, ASEAN, fine. So ACCA produced this thing called the Test Reach platform. It's not identical, is it, to the real exam environment, but it's pretty close. And certainly your college, or whatever you're using for preparation, should be using Test Reach quite a lot. And certainly all my questions are on Test Reach. And of course, there's a blank workspace, isn't there, which you can practice on. I wasn't going to talk about that particularly, but just to make you aware, invest in the technology if you're going down the remote invigilation. I can advise you if you want to reach out to me, or I'm sure Sam can help too. And certainly, practice on Test Reach. It's very good, Test Reach, I do think. It's got its problems, but it's not bad. Choosing a tutor, well, for goodness sake, let me tell you this, that performance management is very specialized. The vast majority of qualified accountants can't do this. The vast majority of tutors can't do this because it can't be learned. You've got to have a feeling for it. You've got to have worked in commercial environments. Experience is extremely important. Yeah, being old is not always the best thing, but being old in this is I think is pretty advantageous. Yeah, and I also think that direct access is very important. WhatsApp support is really important. So pick someone that can contact you. Yeah, I've got students all around the world. I've got a couple from America, various people from different parts of the world. China, Malaysia is quite an important market for me. Maybe this will, as ASEAN, could become important. Who knows? Yeah, and also I think marking. Oh my word, is that important? So on a revision course, you should really expect to be able to submit questions for marking to the marker. And I think that passionately, I do my own marking. 4 questions come in during revision. And they're all marked and you get feedback. And the way that I do it anyway, is that you get it handwritten marked like this. But also I give you a voice message for every question that you submit, so where you're going wrong and you can understand where you're going wrong and therefore improve. This particular script on the screen, you can see no marks at all in the first 3 paragraphs because they do long-winded introductions, which is incredibly common because when you were learning how to write at school, there was this thing called beginning, middle, and end, wasn't there? And we get very anxious about the beginning, don't we? And you feel as though you need to define lots of things. Here's the bad news. You don't score an APM for that. The examiner is not interested in you demonstrating your knowledge. The examiner is interested in you answering the question. So you must do that, and you've got to be super careful. Yeah. So in summary, yeah, look, evaluation is really important. And it's not the conclusion, it's taking the marker along the road with you in order to form an opinion. It doesn't matter what your opinion is at the end. Your conclusion is irrelevant, really. In terms of marks, 7/8 of the marks is for the evaluation and explaining the arguments. Remember, you're in a deregulated environment, so you can't make unjustified statements. Or other way of looking at that is when you're learning, remember to make sure you do understand the why of something. I was talking to my stepson the other day, who's doing mathematics at A level here in the UK. And I'm saying, well, why is that? Why is this? And he said, well, why do you want to worry about that? I just need to know what to do. And funnily enough, he's now moved on to what's called advanced hires in Scotland. He was doing hires. He's now doing advanced hires. And advanced hires, they're starting to ask that question, why? And there's no doubt that the APM examiner is interested. Because of a lack of regulation, everything is subjective. So I'm afraid you're just making unsubstantiated opinions. You need to justify yourself. Yeah. And also, thirdly, application. It's not about whether ZBB is good. It's whether ZBB is good here. That's important. And rote learning is, I'm afraid, of limited use. And that's a real blow in some environments. I've got limited experience around the world, but I have been to India, Pakistan, Russia, South Africa, and everywhere I go, the educational background's different and the priorities are different. So in India, for example, they do tend to, their accountants do tend to be very good at rote learning and memorizing everything, and they think that's a good thing. Well, unfortunately, along's come the internet and made that all rather pointless. Because if I want to know anything, I can look it up, can't I? So, ACCA are quite rightly saying, well, actually, that's no longer a skill that's valued. Damn, that's a bit of a blow, but it's not, is it? If you're having a discussion with someone one evening about who won this or who ran in that race, or, what's the highest mountain in the world and how high it is, I know, because I'm looking it up. I can ask Siri, can't I? So pure knowledge, rote learning doesn't cut it. And quite rightly, I completely support the ACCA in that regard. And APM is right. Yeah. So there must be specifics in the question that you need to apply. Feel free to reach out, guys. I'm on LinkedIn. I'm on WhatsApp. There's my number. I've got free content on YouTube. If you want to get some free help, you can do that. I've got an email address. Email, I don't know, it's all very last year. I do think WhatsApp is an absolute game changer in education. So feel free to WhatsApp me if you wish to. And good luck to everybody. And apologies for my photo, but it's the only one that I look young enough in. And that's a St Andrews Golf Club. I'm not a member, but I have played there. I'm a keen golfer. Single figure handicap, even though I say so myself. Look, guys, it's been a pleasure. I hope that was useful, and I'll just hand over to Sam, I suppose, for any concluding comments.
Just to say thank you to you, Jeff, for the webinar. I'm sure the students that have attended have benefited greatly from your expertise. And just to let everyone know, I did put it in the chat as well, that I will be sending a follow-up email in the next day or so with the recording of the webinar, and also Jeff's contact details again, should you be interested in learning more from him. Thank you, everybody, and have a fabulous evening.
Yes, indeed.
Glad that you all attended.
Okay, thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone. Take care. Goodbye.
Okay, bye-bye.